Hello and welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Ben McElroy. You're here with Justin and Will. Today we're talking about Eastern politics. Will, you want to kick us off?
Yes, specifically, we're going to be focusing on what appears to be the imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine, what we think is going to happen, what we think is going to happen afterward, and what the U.S. should do now and later. Justin?
Well, I want to preface by saying we, are recording this, let it be known, February 7th, 2022. So whatever happens tomorrow or in the coming days, obviously we have no idea, but it should be interesting to see how everything pans out.
Also at 7:30 Chicago time. True. Just in case the Russian invasion will happen in tonight. It's this imminent.
Additionally, a lot of people have been lending their voice to this topic, and a lot of times they're not really saying anything, or they're just fear-mongering, or, it's like some legitimate analysis mixed with some stuff that just makes absolutely no sense. So really what we're going to try to do throughout this episode is lend interesting new perspective, maybe on questions that people haven't asked. It's not necessarily just going to be, will Russia invade Ukraine? Obviously, we're not experts, but we're going to try to, maybe look at this from a different light.
Wait. We're not experts? Why are we discussing this? Guys.
We're amateur strategists.
There we go.
And fans of history.
I've played enough strategy games in my day.
Yes, I've put my fair share of hours into Hoi 4, so I know exactly what I'm talking about.
That's accurate.
Yep.
Well, I guess let's start this off real quick because we already know what's going on. We already know how the Ukrainians feel. We already know how the Russians feel. Will and Ben, do you think the U.S. should intervene, if anything were to happen? And, do you think what we're doing now is enough? Do you think what we'll end up doing is enough? What are your thoughts on that? Do we even have a right to intervene?
Well, what we should do and what we can do, unfortunately, are two different things at this point. We cannot deploy a ground army to counter the Russians because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. For whatever reason, we completely neglected to get them into NATO in time, and now it appears that window of opportunity is closed. So if we could, we should fight the Russians in Ukraine, because we all learned the hard way in the early 20th century what appeasement will do to democracy in Europe. And Russia may be at its strongest point militarily anytime in the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's already annexed Crimea. It's supporting rebels in the Donbass and in Transnistria. We need to stop their momentum now before it gets out of control, and we need to spend even more money and even more lives putting a stop to it later.
I think that's really interesting that you said they're at the height of their power that they have been probably for the past 30 years, because I would definitely agree with that. They definitely suffered substantial military degradation after the breakup of the Soviet Union. If you look at where they were, when they were fighting the Chechens, and they were sending inexperienced, teenage Russian soldiers into Chechnya, and they were just dying in droves from, Chechen rebels. That's a lot different than what we see going on outside of Ukraine's borders, because this is a very well organized force. It's relatively modern, as a whole, whether that's armor, whether that's helicopters or any other kind of air vehicles, whether that's surface or ground deployed missiles. So they've definitely upped their game. And obviously, logistically speaking, it's right next to their own country. So they're in a prime position to strike. So I would definitely agree with you there, Will. I think also that what we could do and what we should do, and even what we're capable of doing, are all very, very different things. And I don't even know if we would deploy directly into Ukraine to begin with. Obviously, they're not a member of NATO, but the way that the West is viewing this is it's Ukraine versus Russia. And everyone's upset because they're like, Russia, stop bullying Ukraine. The way that Russia is viewing this is it's Russia versus Ukraine and NATO. It's really easy to sit back from the United States or from the UK and be outraged that Russia is bullying a country outside of its own borders. But if you're a Russian, just an average citizen, and you're hearing this information that Ukraine is being backed by NATO, The U.S. is deploying troops to the Baltics. Germany is now starting to send supplies. They've kind of taken a little bit more of a firmer stance. The UK, France, they've all been providing military aid. That looks like it's 25-1 to the Russians.
Yeah, the Russians have a history. If you look at their geopolitical history, they're known for being politically insecure, and with good reason. The French and the Germans twice, as well as the Mongols, have all conquered huge swaths of Russian territory, because if you look at a topographical map of Russia, it's flat. It's flat all the way from the border to the Ural Mountains. And once you get past the Ural Mountains, it gets flat again until you reach the other end of the country that's on the other side of the world. So from a military standpoint, flat ground is inherently indefensible. And it's only the size of Russia that has prevented it from being totally conquered in the past. When Napoleon took his grand army and he marched into Russia, the Russians were just able to keep retreating backward. And time eventually just wore out Napoleon's army, and he left Russia with a sixth of the men that he walked in there, and they squeaked out with their lives. And Justin is right. NATO is surrounding Russia. And if I were Putin, the Ukraine would be next on my target list. If I were in Putin's shoes at this day and age, I would do this exact same thing, because securing the Ukraine is fundamental to Russian security for numerous reasons.
Will, I don't want to skip over, Ben. I know you want to say something, and I want you to chime in here, but I don't want to skip over what you brought up, not even just geopolitically, but simply like geologically. The Great European Plain, for anybody listening, if you've ever looked into it or you get curious, stretches all the way from the Atlantic coast in France through Northern Europe. And then basically once you get to Russia, it just turns into complete flat terrain. So Will's entirely correct. That's exactly how Napoleon did it. He marched through Northern Prussia, through Poland, Lithuania, entered Russia. That's exactly how the Germans did it. That's why Blitzkrieg was so effective. Twice. Yeah, twice. So historically speaking, the Russians have always wanted some form of not even just, defense in like a military sense where they like want to have troops on their border, but defense from a terrain standpoint. When when your country is literally plains with no mountains, no valleys, no nothing, it's extremely hard to defend from an opposing force.
If you will visualize, you are attacking an enemy fort that's just on open ground, like that's in Russia. Everything's flat. You can see everything coming from miles away. And then imagine taking a fort that's on top of a mountain. Very different types of battlefields. Ben, you look like you were going to say something earlier.
I was just going to say everything you said is true, except for in the winter, all Russian troops get a +5 for weather advantage.
This is all Rasputitsa aside.
Yes. No, it's very interesting, and you guys took it in a way that differed from how I immediately interpreted the question. To me, it immediately becomes a question of what is national sovereignty and what guarantees a company its own sovereignty. And so what we're encountering right now is a country impeding on another country's territory that has been, collectively basically agreed upon, like, hey, these are the borders of your country. This is not really a problem that like we in the United States have. There's no countries really next to us. Obviously, there's one above and below us, but there's no one that is actively trying to slowly claw their way into Texas. And you don't really see the Canadians trying to get into Alaska or anything like that. Like, we have what are considered like firm boundaries. And in these Western countries, especially when we are politically, economically so closely tied, we have this agreement to basically say, hey, what's yours is yours, what's ours is ours. Let's improve what we have. What's happening right now is Ukraine and Russia both feel like they have claim legally to this land. And now you're getting two nations actually at the brink of war, which is something we really haven't seen pretty much since World War II at any grand scale. Would you guys agree with that?
I would absolutely agree. What
I
we're
would
talking
certainly.
about is the imminent end to the long peace, where we're about to see two nations that are ranked in the top 50 largest economies in the world. They have fielded armies and are staring each other down across the border. And everybody, well, most people believe that they're going to come to blows. They're going to believe that Russia is going to step across that border and they're going to smack Ukraine right across the face and push in towards the capital. And that's going to be something that we haven't seen since the war.
Right. Yeah, we haven't seen that since the end of World War II. And I mean, obviously, the Cold War, there were minor conflicts all across the globe, but none between, serious global powers or, anyone within the top 50 leading economies, especially. So I think it's important when you start breaking it down and diving into like why this is even happening, like, because we could sit here and say, is Russia going to invade? It looks more and more likely by the day. I was definitely in the camp just a few days ago of I think that the media is hyping it up maybe a little too much, and diplomacy still could prevail, but they were kind of painting this picture of inevitable conflict. But now as time goes on, it really, really seems to be the case. So when you wonder like how could we have even gotten here, if you think about Russia's motives, Russia not only views Ukraine as a natural buffer, not because it's defensible because of the terrain. It's not just part of the Great European Plain. So obviously, if someone was trying to invade, they have not only additional territory but highly defendable territory. But they view it not even just as an asset, but as lost territory that already belongs to them. Back in 2021, Vladimir Putin penned an essay kind of outlining the extreme similarities between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people and how they're practically the same thing. Their cultures are intertwined, their languages are intertwined. They may as well just be joined under one union because that's what's right. And obviously that was the case under the Soviet Union. And even today, Russian is spoken more throughout Ukraine than Ukrainian. If you go to Kiev, all the signs are in Ukrainian, but practically everyone is speaking Russian. And even the way we're saying that, Kiev in Ukrainian is Kiev, but everyone's, not everyone, in the politically correct sense, it's Kiev. But obviously we're still saying Kiev, Kiev, Kiev. That's the Russian pronunciation. So Russia is not only fighting for, an extra piece of defense outside of its own borders, but they're fighting for something that they want to reclaim, that they already think is theirs.
It's also important to point out that Ukraine doesn't really have a history of independence. For centuries, it has been a part of a larger state. In the 1600s, it was part of the Ottoman Empire when it stretched all the way up into Europe. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it was part of the Soviet Union. Really, for generations, this is the first decades-long stretch that Ukraine has been more or less politically independent. It has its own color on the map. It has its own president, its own elections. We're going to put an asterisk next to that because we're sure we're going to talk about that later. But this is the first time that Ukraine has been independent. And that's part of the reason why Putin thinks this is so scary, is because he doesn't really have his fist around Ukraine like he used to. And what he doesn't want is for it to join this growing alliance in the West that is inherently anti-Russian. And if you look at the map of NATO-aligned countries, Russia's being surrounded. You have all the traditional NATO allies in the West. You have Turkey in the South. You have India, which is a U.S. ally. And then you have Japan. And only recently did Russia start forging alliances with nations like China to try and just equate some sort of power balance. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, well, what am I trying to get at, Justin?
What are you trying to get at? I'm going to try. I don't know if I can speak for you, but I'm going to try to dissect what you're getting at. Before I do, while I make that attempt, it's really hard as I dive into this to distinguish like good from bad guy. I mean, on the surface, it's easy. Okay, obviously, what the Russians are doing is abhorrent, and we don't support that at all. We've talked on this podcast before how every single nation and every single group of people has the right to self-determination. So when you see the U.S. doing things like expanding into their former sphere of influence, when they basically swooped up the Baltics and got them to join NATO, when you have Finland and Sweden now considering joining NATO. That's directly because of the Ukrainian actions right now. But we have Turkey in NATO. So
which is a historic Russian enemy, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. So when you see the U.S. aligning themselves with not only longstanding Russian enemies, but former territories, right on their front door, not even their back door. I mean, it's on their front door. You can start to understand why the Russians, are getting kind of worried. And it's almost like a catch-22 for them, or a zero-sum game, I should say, is where now that their military has been built back up and they've reduced spending, they're prepared for these sanctions. They're ready to take any sort of hit. Putin's been preparing for that for 3 to 4 years at this point. It's almost like if he's gone this far, why wouldn't he? They want to regain the sphere of influence. They want to counteract these things. They're left in this position of, well, if we don't retake our former territories, the West is going to continuously build stronger and stronger alliances with them, and we're going to look weak. And if we do, the West is simply going to become antagonized. So, where are we left?
Ben?
I think it's very interesting, the notion that these nations deserve to exist and they deserve what they have. I'm not saying that I don't agree with that mindset. I'm just saying that throughout the majority of human history, your independence, your sovereignty was earned constantly. And if anyone challenged that, just like war now, there were, criteria that your actions had to fit in. But essentially, like if my army's stronger than your army and we besiege your town and we take it, like we get it. And that's just the way it is for a large chunk of human history. And we like to think that, oh, now we're so much more advanced, or now we're so much more intelligent, whatever you may say. This was still relatively the mindset even during World War II, is Britain and all these other countries like gobbled up territory, and they were like, hey, like we've conquered this, like maybe to liberate it from one party or the other, but those actions have lingering consequences. The USSR went through Ukraine to get to Germany, and they didn't just pull out of Ukraine after World War II. Like that then became part of their territory. So it's just interesting. There's a lot at stake.
So I want to stay focused on the Ukrainian topic here, but I'm interested to get opinions on this from you too, because it is a really strong parallel, Ben. If you talk about Britain and France goes into these places and liberates them, sometimes with the intention of keeping it, sometimes with the intention of not. Not perfect, but in my mind, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. An appropriate juxtaposition for what we're seeing right now, the potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, is the Suez Crisis back in the 50s with Britain and France. Egypt obviously becomes an independent country after World War II, and Britain wants to regain control of the Suez Canal because that's absolutely critical to keeping trade routes open for the empire where the sun never sets. And when they go through with this and they drop paratroopers in and they take control of the dam and, really start to stir some things up with a now sovereign nation, the U.S. was absolutely furious. They were beside themselves. They requested that the Brits, pull back all their troops, that this was no longer like their fight to fight anymore. It was an Egyptian canal, and that was kind of the way it was. And they were also just so angry because the Brits had said nothing about it to them, intelligence-wise. They just went ahead and did it. So it's not like the U.S. is simply doing this because it's Russia. Yes, it's Russia. It's a, enemy of coming up on 80 years here, I suppose. Enemy, I guess. But they did it to their own allies in the past as well in order to preserve the sovereignty of other nations. Obviously, they had their own interests in mind, but that really marked when Britain was no longer the superpower that it was. They came out of the war crippled, but failing the Suez Crisis meant that they were done. So when Russia hinges on the same sort of thing, if they fail this Ukrainian invasion, do they become a laughingstock, I guess? What do you guys think?
I think we need to strangle Russian ambition in the crib.
Please tell us how you really feel.
I believe I just did. No, I'm not saying we need to assassinate political figures or launch missiles across the ocean or anything. But if Putin is willing to play a game with a certain set of rules on an agreed upon table, we need to field some pieces and we need to defeat him. We need to beat him at his own game. If he wants to take over Ukraine through military force, then we should oppose him through military force. We should not escalate, but we should not de-escalate. We should match him point for point.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I don't think there's any point in not.
And this is where Ben should have chimed in, but
yeah, we'll have to fill the space.
Yeah, it's all right. We're gonna edit this out anyway. But we had a solid run.
Sorry, guys. There was somebody banging a glass door out there, and it was like egregiously annoying. So I had to mute myself, and then I was like, it kind of sounds like someone's trying to like get out of a room, and I had to like make sure that like there wasn't someone like locked somewhere.
Oh, wow.
But yes, we will edit this out. Let me make a note. 49.
Okay.
Okay.
We should maybe take like a 10-second pause as like a reset.
So go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Ben. No. Sorry. Okay, give it 5 seconds. Go ahead.
I think very similarly to Will, maybe not as child murdering in my views.
I'm sorry, what now?
Strangle their ambitions in the crib. Sorry. All right, we're gonna try this one more time.
Jesus.
Yeah, I'm about to say he said it, but you didn't have to.
I've said some pretty racy things, but that crosses the line. I am no child.
55. 5, 4, 3. I think largely Will and I are on the same page. This is not a situation where you want it to continue to escalate. I'm a big believer that our appeasement strategy in World War II, had we taken a much firmer stance, I'm not sure that World War II would have taken place the way that it did. I'm not saying that conflict would not have happened, because I absolutely think it would have, but it was very foolish for Western powers to think that just by simply giving in to Hitler's demands that he'd be like, oh, okay. Because to me, if I can bully 5 other countries into giving me whatever I want, like, why stop? Like, what are they going to do? Call my bluff? Okay. That went real great for Poland and France. Now, again, same situation here. Like, this is a very risky move for Russia. Like, there's a lot on the line, but the stakes aren't going to get any easier as time goes by. And so if Russia is going to make a decision, like the sooner that it commits one way or the other, I think the better of a chance they have. But I don't foresee any long-term solution to where Russia comes out unscathed from this.
I kind of see this as this is the acid test for NATO. Putin is pushing our buttons, and he's going to see what we do. Because if we simply put, let Ukraine fall to the Russians, that will enable him it'll give him the confidence that he needs to be more aggressive elsewhere. Like, if he wants to establish the the Soviet borders or the Russian Empire borders and get even more of that buffer zone that he can use to defend his vulnerable core territory, if NATO just kind of stands by and doesn't really put in the effort that they need to stave off this Russian invasion, it will stoke the fire of Russian ambition, specifically under Putin's leadership, to potentially invade elsewhere, especially in Central Europe, maybe even Eastern Europe. We already know that Belarus is in cahoots with the Russians. The Russians have an army on the southern border of Belarus, which is on the northern part of Ukraine, if anybody doesn't know their maps. So he's already forging those alliances. He's got those armies mobilized, and he is ready to go. It's kind of easy to see where his global ambitions lie. And it may not have started here, but this is where it should stop.
It's an interesting analysis of when you're saying, what is NATO going to do? Because their buttons are absolutely being pushed. And up until this point in time, just to try to draw some sort of analogy, NATO has kind of been a paperweight. I mean, it hasn't really done much. It hasn't really ever bared its teeth, nor has it really ever had to in the European sphere. But It's mostly funded by the US. It's mostly backed militarily by the US. So NATO, strategically speaking, is spearheaded by the United States. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So you're in this interesting position where the US almost has more of a stake in this than mainland European countries. And so if you dissect it, if I'm a European country and you look at what some of these countries are doing right now and their attitudes towards the current situation, they're still, it hasn't even been 100 years since World War II, and it's only been 120 since, well, less. It's only been 100 since the Great War. So that's still extremely fresh. Those scars are still very real. You can still see that almost everywhere you go, and that's not just in the battlefields and in the nature or in the land of the continent. That's in the hearts and the minds of the people there still. So they are not eager to see some sort of international conflict again. So they're obviously very wary, even though they are part of NATO and Ukraine was/is a potential member. They're not right now. So if they aren't necessarily defending a nation state, or excuse me, a member state, then what incentive do they have? But for America, being that they're the primary funders, the primary supplier of troops to this military alliance, even though they're not on the continent, they almost have more of a stake. They're like, look, this is what's going on. Yeah, of course we're going to act on it. We didn't put this whole thing together for nothing.
An example of what Justin is saying, there are some parts of Soviet successor states that took 30 years for their populations to recover to pre-war levels. That's how fresh that this stuff is. You will see some old people and you'll see some young people, and you'll see just an entire gap, like an age group that just is not there. That is, if you walk around Russia or some of these parts of Ukraine, you can see that how fresh that these scars are. So yeah, Justin's absolutely right. We're not chomping at the bit for World War III. Everybody knows that world wars typically aren't the best for everybody, with the United States being the notable exception. But that's because we were never invaded. When Russia was invaded during the Second World War, a third of their country was destroyed, like an important part of their country. If you take that and compare that, if that happened to the United States, it would be everything from the eastern seaboard all the way up to the Mississippi would be demolished, destroyed. Most people there killed and would have fled in forced migration. So we're not trying to start World War III. And if I were Putin, my invasion plan for Ukraine would be set in stages where we'd conquer some territory and we'd bargain. We try to make a deal. See, look, we have this, let's make a deal. And if they don't want to make a deal, we conquer a little bit more, and then we come back to the table. So this war is not going to be about taking cities and killing off populations. It's going to be about acquiring bargaining chips, because diplomacy is a far more effective tool for getting what you want nowadays than it was before.
It brings up this interesting question and this idea, like immediately what you said is like, we do not negotiate with terrorists, was like immediately what popped into my mind. And maybe that's a Hollywood cliche, but I'm curious if that would play into the mindset of more Western countries being like, no, you don't get to annex part of a country, hold it hostage, and demand better trade rights, or, whatever it is. Like, I can foresee a large chunk of the population crying out, saying, absolutely not. Like, there will be no quarter for those that, detract from national sovereignty. And I feel like that would be a massive public outcry.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. A large part of the Ukraine's defense plan is training its civilian population into paramilitary groups. Now, these are not not
an effective
official
strategy.
Yeah, these are not official soldiers, but they are receiving equipment and training from the government of Ukraine in guerrilla warfare and covert resistance. There was a poll put out a few, if not several years ago, on what percentage of the Ukrainian population would be willing to commit to armed resistance to Russian occupation. And it was somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 35% of the entire population would be willing to take up arms and fight off the Russian invaders. So if Russia...
That's voluntary 35%.
Yes, that is a voluntary 35%. Yeah. Now, with that in mind, Russia if Russia invades, it will be able to take Ukraine easily without foreign intervention. It's going to be holding it that is going to be the problem. So they're going to want to take this territory and they're going to want to make a deal, or they're going to want to do something with it, because these, partisans, this resistance that will inevitably rise up will be the biggest thorn in Putin's side. Because what we've learned from occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan is that we need one soldier for every 20 civilians, not partisans, but civilians. And in order to keep the Ukrainian population under their boot, Russia would need like some 350,000 soldiers in Ukraine alone. And that requires a huge amount of money, and it's just going to be expensive. He's going to want to bargain that away as quickly as possible. Time is not on the Russian side, because the longer that Putin waits to launch this invasion, the stronger Ukraine's defenses will become.
The issue is, even if, obviously, if enough time passed, the Ukrainians would gain more and more of a chance. But at this moment, if they were to invade right now, I don't really think that in a conventional, in a pitched fight, that they would really stand too much of an actual chance. Obviously, they're going to fight as hard as possible, but it's just undeniable that the Russians right now are fielding superior firepower in numbers and in technology, and just in terms of number of armor in general. So that would be extremely difficult to defend against. So they would need, in order to actually repel a full-scale Russian invasion, they would need outside assistance, and I just don't think that they would get it. So then we're stuck in this awkward position of, let's say they do take Ukraine, the whole of it. Does NATO decide that they're just going to push back in, or what do they do then? Do they bargain with the Russians so that they'll leave and obtain some kind of deal?
I don't know.
I also want to point out that, or at least, ask you the question, Ben, of where do you see, if ever, this sort of thing stopping? Because we've seen it before, that oftentimes this is just a domino, the first of many. So if Putin decides to invade Ukraine and occupy it, I don't for 1 second believe that that's the end game. Not at all.
Not at all, myself either. I think one of the difficult things with looking for a border, if that is potentially on their list of why they want Ukraine, is like we want a unified border to protect our country, right? Well, if you truly take over the Ukraine, and let's say somehow Ukraine gets taken by Russia and NATO resists but fails, which would be horrible on the global stage. Now you have Ukraine, as the new Russian border up against different countries that are now extremely angry. And so what do you do now? Do you just say, oh, well, we'll fortify Ukraine and keep that as a buffer state between Russia and, the Ukraine, what is now Russia and like true Russia? Maybe, but probably not. Probably it's like, okay, well, what's next? Do we just take over all of Europe? Could they take over all of Europe? They could have in 1945. Missed the boat. So I don't know. I don't foresee any military acts stalling at the borders of Ukraine.
I disagree.
You think so?
Yeah. I think Putin wants Ukraine, and only Ukraine, in this specific part of the world. Because Putin, I'd be willing to bet that Putin does not want to take over the world. I mean, everybody wants to take over the world, even people like you and I. It's deep down, it's one of our deepest desires, and it'd be a fool not to admit it. But what Russia wants is just to feel secure and safe. And the best way for them to do that without spending the millions, if not billions of dollars that they would need to keep Ukraine annexed is, yes, they would negotiate away their conquered territory, but they would negotiate with the Ukrainians, not NATO. The best case scenario for Russia right now is if NATO kept their hands free of this whole thing. And the reason that I believe that Putin's going to invade in 3 or 4 stages is because he wants to establish a puppet state in Ukraine. A president that answers to Putin, does what Putin wants, and then that Ukrainian president will keep his population under control without the need of an occupying Russian army, so that Putin can take his money and his soldiers and his influence and his natural resources and focus it elsewhere on fortifying a different section of his border. Because the end goal is to feel safe, not take over the world.
I don't know. What do you think, Justin?
I think Will makes an interesting point. I don't necessarily want to rule out any kind of aggression towards the Baltics. It's not there at the moment, but who knows what could happen after some kind of showdown with Ukraine. I do absolutely agree that. Sorry, can we? I'm gonna be honest. You're gonna need to give me. I want to make my next point, but we're gonna have to take a silence break in order to.
Yeah, we're probably pulling up the same thing, dude.
I need to look at a map, dude. Okay, what are the regions called? The Abkhazia and
What?
dude.
Regions of Ukraine, regions of Europe.
I will tell you right now. They are in. Oh my gosh. It's Abkhazia and. I'm sorry, I know I'm putting
no idea what you're talking about right now.
Okay, here. I'll break it down for you. What, Ben?
For whatever reason, my laptop charger got unplugged, and my laptop's about to die.
That's no good. No good.
We got it.
Okay, here we go.
All right, count it in.
Okay, so remind me of where you left off, or where I left off. Let's just start from where you left off again.
Putin wants to feel safe, not take over the world.
Okay. I'm going to start at 103. Well, I would definitely agree with you in saying that he doesn't want to take over the world. I'm not going to rule out any kind of aggression towards the Baltics right now because we just don't know. It's too early to tell. We have no idea what kind of play he may have planned depending on how things go with Ukraine. And obviously those are still in that post-Soviet sphere. But obviously we don't know. We can't see inside the man's head. We can only make assessments based upon troop positioning and, past historical events and, what we can piece together about what might happen in the future. However, I think your assessment about he may want to fortify other areas definitely makes a lot of sense. If he finds widespread success in Ukraine and manages to establish a puppet state like he practically has in Belarus, I mean, Lukashenko is bowing at his feet. There's no denying it. It's basically just an extension of Russia right there. And as long as that new Ukrainian president would vow to, keep his own population in check, that would allow them to free themselves up and look to reinforce their influence in other places. Like if you look at, kind of on Russia's southern border. So obviously a lot of times when we think about like post-Soviet, we think about Eastern Europe. Okay. And Ukraine is a huge part of that. But if you look at like Georgia, down towards the Caucasus and all that stuff, there are two independent republics being, Abkhazia and South Ossetia that declared their independence from the Georgian state and were backed and supported by Russia. So, maybe checking a couple boxes in the east would allow them to then focus back down maybe on their southern border, or maybe, more so in the Middle East or on their eastern border. It would definitely free up some resources for them to focus elsewhere.
I agree. On the same page for that.
Also, I want to ask you guys' take. This is extremely recent, within the past couple of days. China and Russia from what it seems like, appeared to have completely recovered from the Sino-Soviet split, being that, they held joint meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping, and they have come out and said that they have vowed to cooperate, and they announced extremely much closer ties, and that there will be no forbidden areas of cooperation. I think that comes at a critical crossroads right now with this whole Ukrainian thing, because beforehand, obviously they had tacit support from China, maybe on back channels in the back rooms amongst the higher ups of the government. This kind of public announcement to the rest of the world saying that there is nothing that our two nations cannot / will not cooperate on or show support for kind of lends some power to Russia, meaning that they know that they have China's backing. So they have China's backing against the U.S. Not like we're going to see Chinese troops invading Ukraine, but
Wouldn't that be nuts?
Any kind of yes, that would be insane. If any kind of vote was to go to the UN Security Council or just to the General Assembly or anything like that, they can count on diplomatic support from China here.
Would that also extend to military support? Because I'm assuming that China and Russia are not like explicitly advertising an anti-United States or anti-West alliance, correct?
It's okay, so they're not advertising an anti-West alliance, but during this press conference, you could potentially discern that from what they were saying and from the verbiage of what was put out, because they pretty much came out, and I want to say that they actually said that this was a new world order. Okay, so that's basically a blatant challenge to what's in place now, and an explicit challenge to the United States. And so if you look at last month or 2 months ago, either right at the end of 2021 or at the beginning of 2022, we have China, Russia, and Iran running joint naval drills. So they are getting their navies together and practicing running naval drills together, preparing for any scenario, showing increased ties militarily. So maybe with this new announcement of close ties, we might see more of that between China and Russia.
The roster for World War III has been dropped, guys.
Trailer just dropped, everybody.
Go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, if that is the case, that's a terrifying implication. It's no secret, I think, that it is this Western versus Eastern unions essentially working. It's very similar to NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the Soviet Union. Obviously, the names have changed, but the geographical regions remain relatively similar. It's not as though Chinese troops under the Chinese flag fought in Vietnam, but Chinese troops were present. And though China labeled them as volunteers, does that really negate the fact that Chinese troops came into combat with American troops during the Vietnam War? Could that be something that we see here shortly if this invasion goes long, or if Russia takes over and then meets firmer resistance from NATO or from the West? Could we see volunteers trickling in from other areas? I don't know. Is that a sneaky way to get out of World War III, or is that?
I think that's a sneaky way to get into World War III.
I think that's a sneaky way to get in as well. I think that's not going to fly on the world stage anymore.
Yeah, if you have Chinese troops taking shots at and being shot at by American troops, whether or not they are there on their government's orders, that is a big red flag, especially in the media. And if that happens, I mean, that could go downhill so fast it would make all of our heads spin. But if I were China and I have just announced this cooperation pact with Russia, if Russia's making moves in Eastern Europe, I would expect China to start making moves in the South China Sea.
So I'm so glad you said that. Before I jump in that, I do want to point out, if you look at Russia's annexation of Crimea started in February of 2014, at that exact moment, the Winter Olympics were taking place in China. So a lot of people were saying that Russia did not want to do anything to upset China right now, kind of upstage their spotlight with the Winter Olympics now occurring. But this is exactly what they did last time. They almost took it as a distraction. The world was watching the international games, and they stepped in and annexed Crimea. I mean, there's potential that they might play by the same game plan. There's an international scapegoat going on, and obviously they know that the Chinese, after this announcement of close ties, aren't necessarily going to really bat any eyelashes over it. They might take that same opportunity. Will, though, to touch on your point, I think that's entirely accurate. Whether or not they actively make some kind of move against Taiwan, I think we definitely see increased aggression in the South China Sea, not just towards Taiwan, but towards any other country that might be contesting Chinese claims in the first or second island chains. Definitely, if Russia is doing this to Ukraine, we're going to see increased hostilities on the other side of the world, on the other side of the continent, I should say. And that's why it's so critical now that NATO does something, or that if they don't do anything, they at least stand together and vow to do something when the time comes. Because if Russia and China are willing to do something, they will. Okay, it's not a matter of them saying like, we're going to do this eventually. That's not a blind, or that's not an empty threat. It's obviously very clear that they have every intention. Okay, so if NATO makes empty promises, yeah, we'll defend you, Eastern European NATO states. Yeah, we won't let you get taken continental Europe. But they just kind of continue to follow with this appeasement train. It could end disastrously, because if you're not willing to counter an enemy who's willing to make harder choices than you are, you're going to lose.
100%.
Yes, agreed. This is, screw it, I'm going to say it. This is the prelude to the next big war. What the 30s was to World War II, right now is to World War III, or whatever label is going to get slapped on it. People are making power moves. I mean, we've seen China. They've been moving pieces around in the South China Sea. I've heard unconfirmed rumors that China is going to make an overt military action on Taiwan in the next 3 to 5 years. That would be my bet. And
2027.
Yep, 2027. I've heard also 2025.
Oh.
And then you can't forget about the Koreas, North Korea, South Korea. North Korea is still our enemy. We fought a war against them, and we fought the Chinese army in Korea. We did, and they pushed us out. We did not win. We did not win that war. I will go ahead and say it. And then, our only two allies, Japan is, I don't know, they're associated with NATO. I don't know if they're a fully fledged member, but
they're not a member, I don't believe.
Japan is a Western ally. And then you also have Taiwan, and then Australia and New Zealand all the way down there at the bottom. So if China is basically like the sun in the Pacific, everything orbits around China over there. And if you looked at economic development in China, they are growing fast. The United States is still the largest economy, and per capita is still the wealthiest in the world. But the rate at which the Chinese economy is gaining on us, that's what's scary. That's why they say that, the next century is going to belong to China. If the data that I've seen and the math that I've seen is correct, then I will absolutely believe it. If China makes a move in the next few years in that sea, we do not have the allies and the armies like we do in Europe to counter them.
I think we need to wait at least a few years, definitely at least 5, until 2030 to see kind of where, at least from an economic standpoint,
Taiwan will not exist in 2030.
I hope it does. We'll find out. Although from an economic standpoint, China has been gaining on the U.S. rapidly, exponentially. This past year, 2021, beginning in 2020, their economy did start to slow down substantially.
Everybody's did.
What?
Everybody's did.
Everybody's did. But if we're just talking about trends, and you look at the Chinese trends, 2021 especially, their economy wasn't stagnating, but it was not growing at this super aggressive rate.
And I'm not an economics professional, and I'm not very informed in that world, but through conversations with Justin and with others, to my understanding, a large chunk of what China did to launch its economy forward was to borrow extremely large amounts of money and capital. And at some point that is no longer a viable economic growth model because the buck does come due, just like my college loans.
Rip.
Rest in peace. Got that first letter today.
Oof.
Oof.
That's why Ben's stressing out. Better work on that resume, bud.
I know.
If he seems
Menards is hiring.
distracted, ladies and gentlemen, he's wondering how much he can get if he enlists right now.
If you
Dude,
look
I
up a
was literally
picture
like-
of crushing financial stress, you'll see a picture of Ben McElroy.
It is not that bad, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be all right. But it's one of these things where you cannot maintain that course because it weakens the foundation upon which your economy is built. I mean, it can, on paper, make you an economy that seems above its weight class, but I'm not sure the infrastructure is there to fully support that. What would you say about that, Justin?
I would say that's interesting when you talk about infrastructure, because the whole point of the borrowing and coming up with this excessive funding was to build infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't get it twisted. China has developed in ways that not even the U.S. has come up with. I mean, their metropolitan areas are just light years behind or beyond what we have right now. That being said, that's on the eastern seaboard, like we talked about in separate areas. Those regions of China that have been heavily funded far outpace the inside and western portions of the country that have had hardly no economic funding, which is also, I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but why communism as a system doesn't just work so well for them, but has to continue to work for them. So not only have they improved their infrastructure, they also just have a lot of unused infrastructure, housing. I mean, there's entire cities that just are empty. Okay. And so if they're empty, they're certainly not generating any sort of revenue. So you definitely need to look at the nitty gritty of, yes, they're growing fast, but you kind of have to dive in and see, break down what are these separate regions doing and all that stuff. When we're talking about economics as well, it's interesting to point out that the Russians are entirely capable of surviving any sort of sanctions for the most part, unless, we're talking, we're not sure what Germany, France, the UK, and the US could really come up with if they were ready to go balls to the wall with some economic sanctions. But if we're just talking about sanctioning a couple oligarchs and their children so they can't go skiing in Colorado, or, they can't go to their favorite vacation spot, that won't do, and excuse me, jack shit to the Russian economy. Okay, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, they've been preparing for economic hardship for 3 to 4 years now. As COVID has been going on, their spending has been extremely minimal. 2021, Putin was actually urged by his economic ministers to spend. They said, this is your opportunity. People are inside. We can focus on ourselves. We can start funding a lot. And he refused. Obviously, he probably had a larger game plan in mind, but they have been stockpiling and they are prepared. It's not like sanctions are going to bring them to their knees immediately. That would be a slow bleed. He was ready for this. He was absolutely ready for this.
It's also worth pointing out that sanctions only cripple Russia's ability to generate, how shall we say, legitimate income.
Correct.
Because, if we prevent them from trading with the rest of the world and generating revenue through imports and exports, if they can't do that because they've been sanctioned, then they will turn to, shall we say, shady methods of acquiring money. A perfect example would be the North Koreans. I mean, we have sanctioned their economy into the ground, and they have turned to cyber warfare, narcotics trafficking, arms distribution, and that all, like, roughly, or at least as far as we can tell, gives Kim Jong-un about $2 billion a year just to play with. That's all from illegal activities, and they haven't imported or exported anything except for what little comes across the border from China. So if you take the Russian economy and you sanction it to the point where it can't export natural gas or oil, yeah, it's going to hit, and it's going to hit hard. You're probably going to see some people starve, but that will not prevent them from making money. And if anything, it will make them turn towards more nefarious means of acquiring and distributing resources.
So Ben, you look like you had something to say. I don't know if this will build off of what you're going to come up with, but when you look at the economy of Russia, obviously the shipping lanes through the North Sea are absolutely critical, vital. It's a lifeline for the Russian economy. Okay. There's a lot that happens landwise to China, to the rest of continental Europe, Germany, especially energy wise. I mean, natural gas and oil. France and Germany, again, Germany especially, is importing so much. So losing your biggest buyers, that's going to cripple you. When we think about, again, motivations for annexing Ukraine, if you look at Ukraine's geography, for those of you that don't like to stare at maps for fun, um, Ukraine's southern border is the Black Sea. Okay, so back in 2014, when Russia annexes Crimea, they now have increased access to the Black Sea. They obtained the city of Sevastopol. But outside of that, their only warm water port, I want to say that in terms of shipping hubs and shipping ports, modern, that Russia utilizes throughout the year, they have anywhere between 15 and 17, potentially 18. There is only one that does not freeze over year round. There is one warm water port that is open annually, and that is Kaliningrad, near Finland. Okay, near where Archangel used to be. That
I
is
would also like to input that after they've annexed Crimea, they now have Sevastopol.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. They have Sevastopol, so they have access to the Black Sea. But Kaliningrad is their only port to the North Sea, and it's the only place that they can use year round. Otherwise, that shit is frozen over. So if they were to be economically sanctioned and they could not get goods out of their one port, that would be horrendous. Another reason why they want Ukraine, they want more access to the Black Sea. Obviously, that leaves them to contend with the Turks, who are still a part of NATO and still don't have to let them through the Bosporus.
And still don't like the Russians.
Correct. Still don't like the Russians, but still, it's strategically speaking, it's a fantastic position for the Russians.
Ben, what do you think?
I don't disagree, like, whatsoever. I think what you guys have both said pretty much sums up my entire field of thought. Like, it's not uneasy to see why Russia is doing this, and I think they know that the time is now if it's going to happen. Especially if they make a faux push into Ukraine, if this is all like, haha, prank, this memory is not going to be lost on the Ukrainians, and it's not going to be lost on NATO. And if something like this were to happen down the road, I doubt there would be such a stall in the process of a response. So I anticipate that this is in reality a movement. I'm not sure if that will actually result in an invasion of Ukraine. I hope not. It's expectant on my part that it will, 100%.
Yeah. If we're, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say they have nothing to gain by giving the Ukraine and NATO more time.
No, nothing at all. If we are, kind of closing things down, I do want to bring up, Will and I were talking before the show, Ben, kind of about if, let's say, they annex the whole of Ukraine, they have access to the Black Sea, and for whatever reason, they're allowed through the Bosporus. Turkey allows them to come through. Russian access to the Mediterranean has, how do I say this? That potentially could be disastrous for Western powers. If
I think we should, yes.
Nefarious ideas. Historically speaking, the Mediterranean has been used as an entry point to Russia, not the other way around. Okay, whether it's the Ottomans or whether you look at the 1860s, 1870s, and you look at the Crimean War, and we have France and Britain going through and going into Crimea, going into Russia, it has never been the other way around, where the Russians are coming out. Okay, so having that new strategic advantage in a new era could potentially shake the game up.
I just think it's so alien to me to imagine Russian ships in the Mediterranean. Like, I've never seen or heard of that ever. And I'd like to consider myself versed in Mediterranean history. And that's just so crazy to me, that to think that that is feasible, that the Russian flag will be on ships sailing out into the Atlantic.
Correct. Tune in next year for when we're all speaking Russian.
I hear it's cold. Bring a hat.
Coming to you live from the American Resistance Underground.
Don't give up, my fellow patriots.
There will be a day. Wolverines.
We'll fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them in the hills, in the streets. All right. So I feel like we're kind of, like Justin said, we're starting to wind down.
My prediction is by the end of February, there will be full-on conflict in Ukraine.
Can you not?
Well, you said they have what, 265,000 combatants mobilized on the
that must
border?
be new. So they have doubled their numbers since earlier.
Don't worry though.
Last week.
It's a drill.
Yeah. Okay. So like, Russia has had soldiers on the border since for almost a decade, like since 2014. When Crimea was annexed, they had about 40,000 troops on the Russo-Ukrainian border. And now today in 2022, it just surpassed 250,000 soldiers. I think we 265. If Putin backs down from this, he's done. He will be ousted from power, most likely from an internal coup, and we're going to have a new player in the game. Now, we could easily go down the rabbit hole on this, on whether or not the devil we know is better than the devil we don't, but Putin's got an army there. He has a reason to invade. He has the means to invade, and it would be a bad idea for him not to invade, whether or not he had an army there to begin with.
That's a terrifying sentence.
I think it's a great contrast to last year. Same time, maybe we're a little ahead of the curve. Like last year, springtime, 2020, let's say March, April, when there were fears of a Russian invasion of Ukraine because there were missile systems on the border. There, emerged videos of Russian armor being transported via train to Belarus and to Ukraine's eastern border. But that really only totaled out to be like 100,000 troops. Okay, and that was reason
only
enough.
100,000 troops.
Only 100,000, right? That is not an insignificant number, especially in the terms of modern military might. For those of us listening, that maybe we should put that in perspective. The U.S. sent 3,000 troops the other day to the Baltics. Okay,
what is that going to do?
Exactly. So 100,000 on its own for contemporary militaries is unprecedented. Typically, you're fighting in much smaller numbers and just making better use of your numbers through tactics and through technology.
Just to put this into perspective for our listeners, what is the largest amount of soldiers that we ever had in Afghanistan or Iraq at any given point?
Let's find. I would say no more than 20,000. Let's see.
I would agree with that.
All right, well, you look that up.
I think it's also pertinent to think
U.S. forces peaked at 100,000 in 2011.
100,000 boots on the ground?
100,000 peaked in 2011.
But was that all combatants, or I'm assuming that was primarily logistics? I mean, you got to feed, you got a house, you got to communications.
Well, in 2012, troop levels, they're just saying troops themselves, troop levels had come down to 77 in 2012. So active personnel from NATO totaled 175,000.
Okay.
So, I mean,
not insignificant by any means, but still less than what Russia currently has on the border. Now,
Correct.
And I want to contrast this.
They have almost 100,000 more soldiers on this border than NATO had in Afghanistan at its peak.
Let's see here.
Well, in case you missed it, at its peak, 100,000 U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, 2011.
What?
175,000 total from NATO. Okay, so even now,
is that total throughout the entire span, or is that at one point?
That is at one time.
What?
Bro, I had no idea it was that big.
Yeah, I had no idea. No, I'm assuming that includes like support personnel, like the.
Well, that's what I said too. It's like it just says troops.
It absolutely must.
It sucks when we're wrong, but here we are.
Okay.
Now,
so we
contrast.
army. Which was that Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm.
August 2010, the U.S. force reaches 100,000.
Okay. Now, and again, not an insignificant amount of people. Contrast
No.
that with 1945, the USSR. Conservative reports were about 11.3 million troops. 11.3
That's also not a
million.
sustainable. You can't feed 11.3 million men.
I'm
and
pretty
get
sure they
them
didn't.
to fight effectively. You said they could.
I'm pretty sure they didn't.
They did exactly.
Now, is it okay? Now this hold on. This is 1945 Red Army.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that is an entirely different animal than 1941 Red Army.
225 infantry divisions.
Jesus Christ! No wonder they were worried about a Russian steamroller just push into the Atlantic.
22
Didn't we have
armored divisions?
Yeah, didn't we have like?
We had
20,
like 6.
Yeah, like 6 divisions in 1947 in Western Europe.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, there was a significant concern that after the fall of Berlin in 1945, that the USSR would just keep pushing all the way through France. And
for those of you who took AP US history, this is where NSC 68 becomes really important.
Facts.
Correct.
It's an interesting idea because we're only 70, 80 years removed, and now we're talking about armies 0.1% the size as being significant. So it's an interesting development.
Yeah, when the Third Reich launched Operation Barbarossa, they had 127 divisions, 1.3 million men, and that was the largest army in the history of the world at that point.
That was unprecedented. No, I mean seriously, 1.3 million.
And they were still able to launch a surprise attack somehow.
Now,
okay.
To be fair, no drones, no internet, no Twitter to let the Russians know they were coming.
Yeah, this army that went to Russia was powered by horses in 1940. Horses.
Also extremely important to note. We're just dropping those strange historical facts. That's entirely correct. Because there is readily available footage, the German army is painted as this extremely capable mechanized force that was just flying everywhere on half tracks and on panzers. In reality, the majority, if not like the extreme majority of the army, was powered by horses and carts.
What do you think carried all that gasoline for the half tracks and tanks? It wasn't half tracks and tanks, I can tell you that.
Got to use gas to get gas, baby.
Okay, so to get back to the matter at hand, final thought. Russia will invade. They will invade soon. NATO will not do enough, and it will empower China to make moves in Asia.
We're all dead by 2045.
Yeah, I do not have the confidence that NATO will step up and do what needs to be done. Ukraine will fall to the Russians.
We better make it to 2076.
I hope so.
I'm trying to hit that.
Otherwise, we're going to be living a real life Fallout Force. Let me tell you that.
Final thoughts. I would say it's entirely possible a Russian invasion occurs. We just simply can't rule it out, especially now that troop numbers have doubled and diplomacy has failed up to this point. I don't think that media hysteria has helped in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that the U.S. Beating their chest and creating sort of an uncertain message amongst its allies has helped at all either. But all of that aside, the fact of the matter is we need to get our heads on straight immediately, because we may not even have a day. We might not even have 12 hours. The fact of the matter is we just don't know. Okay, when there's an enemy force that capable and that close, who knows what they could do? I mean, there could be a false flag incident. Then maybe they decide they don't even need one. Maybe they just decide to go for it. What we need to do is stand together. NATO needs to actually bare its teeth for once in its lifetime, and the U.S. needs to stand alongside its allies and show that even though we've been through ups and downs these past 4 years, we are more than capable and more than willing and still plenty strong enough to support the people who rely on us.
President
Absolutely.
Biden, if you are listening, this is your chance to prove that NATO is not a paper tiger.
Side note, if the president is listening to our podcast, please like and subscribe. That goes for the FBI agent also watching our podcast.
Hashtag
I have no dissenting opinions from what you guys just said. This is the litmus test of combat, and we will see if NATO can survive.
I am not optimistic.
Nor am I.
I am blindly optimistic.
I just paid for LASIK, so I can't be with you.
Oh,
And on that terrible disappointment, it's time to end.
Good luck, Ukrainians.
Thank you all again, Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Good luck to you. We're with
Remember,
you.
Wolverine.